If you thought the story of Frankenstein was over, then you are right. And wrong at the same time. War of the Gargantuas, released in 1966. The movie focuses on two giant hairy creatures, a brown gargantua named Sanda who lives in the mountains, and a green gargantua who lives in the oceans called Gaira. The movie doesn't waste any time setting up. It gets right into the plot immediately, with Gaira going on a rampage, and then the two monsters appear together and basically start fighting. It's a little more complicated than that, and we'll get to that later, but that's pretty much the overall plot of this movie. Now, the Japanese title of this film is Frankenstein's Monsters, Sanda vs. Gaira. And it's important that I mention this because depending on which version of the film you watch, this is either a sequel to Frankenstein vs. Baragon, or it's its own movie. In the Japanese version, the movie refers to the creatures as Frankensteins, at least until a certain point where they're called Gargantuas. And they said that both monsters spawned from the pieces of Frankenstein from Frankenstein vs. Baragon. Sanda was created first, and then Gaira soon after. But in the American version, they're just two hairy creatures that just pop up. No real explanation, they're just there. But regardless of which version you watch, I find this to be a thoroughly more entertaining movie than Frankenstein vs. Baragon, because it really gets you into the action right away. The fight choreography between the two monsters is really spectacular. I think it's another instance where they didn't use high-speed photography like they do with so many of the other monster movies. And it's a little more influential than Frankenstein vs. Baragon. One reason in particular is because this is the introduction to the maser cannons, probably the most famous fictional Toho weapon, which are these giant laser cannons that would later on appear in a couple of Godzilla movies in the Showa era through stock footage, and then there would be a different variation of them in the 90s, and then these direct versions of the cannons would reappear in two Godzilla films from the Millennium series. And it also introduced the famous military march that would accompany these cannons throughout the second Godzilla series, once again composed by Akira Iwakube. Do 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 do. It goes on. You fans know what it is. But unlike with some of the Godzilla creatures, where most of them are reptilian, the maser cannons and the overall military actually pose a threat to the Gargantuas, mainly Gaira. Since Gaira is actually a mammal and not a reptile like so many of the other Godzilla monsters, he's easily harmed by the tanks, bullets, maser cannon fire, and to the point where the military almost kills the monster if it weren't for Sanda coming in at the last minute and helping him. Which actually leads into my favorite part of this whole movie, the fact that the monsters don't start off fighting. Both monsters look identical, and if you watch the Japanese version, they both spawned from the Frankenstein monster. So when Gaira is critically wounded by the military, Sanda comes in to pretty much save his brother, and instead of destroying tanks and maser cannons, he gestures to the military stop, and then he takes Gaira away off into the mountains where he can heal. All of a sudden, two of our characters, played by Russ Tamblyn and Kumi Mizuno, show up on the mountain with a bunch of campers. Gaira attacks, eats all of the campers, but our two main characters get away, and Sanda actually saves Kumi Mizuno from falling off a cliff, because when Sanda was much younger, he was experimented on by these two scientists. So you could definitely tell that Gaira is evil and will eat and devour people. Sanda is more peaceful and actually has a soft spot for humans, mainly Kumi Mizuno, because every Toho fan loves her. But my favorite part of this movie is once Sanda finds out what his brother truly does. When he returns to Gaira, he finds a bunch of human clothes on the ground, and right there you can tell that Sanda is pissed off. He grabs a tree trunk, smacks Gaira with it, and that's what starts them fighting. And from there on, it's a very well choreographed fight because, well, two reasons. A, because the Sanda and Gaira suits are less bulky than some of the Godzilla suits, so the action is a lot more fast-paced, and it looks a lot more intense. They don't have to worry about breaking off a piece of the suit or getting tangled in some wires. Another thing is that you can actually see the real suit actor's eyes. Haruo Nakajima, the original suit actor who played Godzilla, who also plays Gaira in this movie, said that this was his favorite role besides Godzilla because it was the only movie where you could actually see his eyes. And in that scene that I told you about, where Sanda finds out that Gaira eats humans, the suit actor that plays Sanda, you could see his eyes. You can tell through his eyes what he's thinking. And I think that's what makes it one of the better Toho monster movies to not feature Godzilla. There are some negative things about it, though. It's not completely perfect. I like it better than Frankenstein vs. Baragon, but it's still not a flawless movie. For one thing, it's really weird that the last movie would have this trio of scientists, and this movie would have the same trio of scientists that are basically the same characters. They're different characters by name, but they pretty much have the same roles. This time around, Nick Adams is replaced by Russ Tamblyn, who is probably more well known for playing the leader of the Jets in West Side Story, probably my favorite musical movie ever. He's a little better to believe to be a scientist than Nick Adams, but I don't know. It's just weird that they would make different characters that are basically the same as in the last movie, but that's a small gripe, because really, you're going to focus on the monster action, and that's what steals the movie. One interesting note about Russ Tamblyn, though, is that director Ishiro Honda actually filmed 2 versions of different scenes. He filmed various scenes for the Japanese version without Russ Tamblyn, and then would film those scenes again with Russ Tamblyn in them for the American version. Because I think Russ Tamblyn is a little more well-known than Nick Adams. That's just me. Because the times I've seen Nick Adams in an American film, he was like a side character. Russ Tamblyn is really known for being the leader of the Jets in West Side Story, so I think he's at least more recognizable. And that might be the reason for those alternate scenes in the US version. In fact, the US version is actually longer than the Japanese version, one of the rare times that's ever happened for one of these movies. The only other time I can think of was Terror of Mechagodzilla. And one other thing I don't like is, this is more like nitpicking, but there's a nightclub scene in this movie with American actress Kippy Hamilton, and she sings this song on stage, and 1, it's a terrible song, and 2, her singing voice is absolutely awful. And I did watch both versions, and I'm pretty sure that's her own voice. And the problem is you have to sit through the entire song from beginning to end. But luckily, right after the song ends, Gaira pops up to wreak havoc. So at least you get that in the end. But in the end, War of the Gargantuas is a movie that I definitely recommend if you have nothing better to do at the moment. It's fast-paced, it's fun, the action scenes are cool, the special effects are fantastic for the kind of movie this is. And it's one of those movies where the US and the Japanese versions are drastically different, but not in a way like with Godzilla Raids Again and Gigantus the Fire Monster, where it will irritate you. One other note about the American version is that since that version removed any trace or mention of the Frankenstein monster, Russ Tamblyn basically had to redub any of his lines that mentioned Frankenstein, so that's a little neat bit of trivia. Another interesting note about this movie goes back to that ending that I told you about in Frankenstein vs. Baragon with the giant octopus. Since that ending ultimately was not used in the American version of Frankenstein vs. Baragon, the opening of the film, where we first get introduced to Gaira, brings back the giant octopus, where both monsters eventually fight each other. And again, it's not as impressive as the one in King Kong vs. Godzilla, but it's still fun to watch. So even though I like this movie a little better than Frankenstein vs. Baragon, I'm going to give it the same rating, good but not great. And the reason is because this is not a movie that I would really recommend to non-fans, but it's still a good watch regardless. Although I do have to give a fair warning if you plan on watching the movie through the Classic Media DVD. The Japanese version of this movie is actually really dark. Sometimes it's hard to make out things that are happening on screen. It's not quite as bad as Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, because you're actually watching a good movie in this case. But I just want to give a heads up that it is a little hard to see some things in there. And the US version is crystal clear. So not trying to scare you away from watching this movie, but just be warned if you watch the Japanese version. And that's my review for War of the Gargantuas. I hope you enjoyed my review. I can't wait to hear what you guys think about the movie, if and when you see it. Like, subscribe, comment, share, check out my official website, and go follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, SoundCloud, and Periscope. This is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there is only one.